After the collapse of the treaty and the death of Ganga Zumba, the Portuguese authorities reached a conclusion they had resisted for decades. Palmares could not be absorbed, pacified, or contained. It had to be destroyed. From the late 1670s onward, colonial correspondence changed in tone. Palmares was no longer described merely as a refuge for fugitives. It was labeled a rebellious state, a black republic, a threat whose continued existence encouraged disobedience throughout the colony. Zumbi's refusal to honor the treaty terms, especially the return of escaped enslaved people, was cited repeatedly as proof that negotiation had failed. His name began to appear more frequently in reports, no longer as a subordinate or dissident, but as the principal obstacle to colonial order. The war entered a new phase. Portuguese campaigns against Palmares grew larger, more systematic, and more brutal. Expeditions were now composed of colonial soldiers, bandeirantes experienced in forest warfare, indigenous auxiliaries coerced or recruited by force, armed settlers promised rewards. These forces carried muskets, artillery, and dogs trained to track human scent. They burned crops, destroyed dwellings, and attempted to starve Palmares into submission. Yet despite these efforts, Palmares endured. This endurance was not accidental. It was the result of institutional knowledge, accumulated over generations. Under Zumbi's leadership, the Confederation refined its wartime organization. Settlements were relocated or rebuilt after attacks. Food production was diversified and concealed. Populations were dispersed to prevent mass capture. Combatants rotated to avoid exhaustion. Palmares did not fight to win battles, fought to remain. Colonial records describe Palmares almost exclusively in military terms. They speak of raids, ambushes, and destruction. What they omit, what must be recovered carefully, is daily life. Even during near-constant war, Palmares functioned as a society. Fields were planted and harvested. Children were raised. Marriages were formed. Rituals were observed. Spiritual life continued, drawing on African cosmologies reshaped by life in the Americas. These practices were not escapism. They were survival strategies. They sustained morale and collective identity. Zumbi's leadership did not suspend ordinary life. Instead, it integrated defense into it. Every adult understood basic combat readiness. Every settlement understood evacuation protocols. War was not a separate sphere. It was embedded in daily existence. This integration made Palmares resilient in ways the Portuguese struggled to comprehend. As Palmares survived campaign after campaign, Zumbi's reputation grew beyond its borders. Enslaved people on plantations spoke his name quietly. Some attempted escape explicitly because they believed he would protect them. Colonial authorities understood the danger of this symbolism. Zumbi was no longer just a military leader. He was becoming an idea, proof that Africans and their descendants could organize, govern, and defend themselves without European oversight. This made him personally dangerous. Bounties were discussed. Informants were encouraged. Psychological warfare accompanied military force. Portuguese narratives increasingly depicted Zumbi as cruel, tyrannical, even demonic. Language meant to strip him of legitimacy and frighten potential allies. But the persistence of these descriptions reveals their failure. Zumbi could not be reduced to propaganda. Despite its resilience, Palmares was not invincible. By the early 1690s, the cumulative effects of war became visible. Repeated attacks reduced food reserves. Constant movement strained families. Losses, though rarely quantified, were real and painful. Zumbi understood these limits. Oral tradition suggests that debates continued within Palmares about strategy. Some argued for renewed negotiation. Others insisted that compromise would only postpone destruction. Zumbi's position remained consistent. Freedom that required the return of others to bondage was not freedom. This stance narrowed options but preserved principle. In 1694, the Portuguese launched what would become the most decisive assault on Palmares. They placed command in the hands of Domingos Jorge Velho, a bandeirante known for his ruthlessness and effectiveness. Unlike earlier expeditions, This campaign was planned with singular focus. The goal was not harassment or containment. It was eradication. The central settlement of Makako was targeted directly. Zumbi prepared for the inevitable. Defenses were strengthened. Populations were repositioned. But the scale of the assault was unprecedented. When Makako fell, it did not mark the immediate end of Palmares, but it shattered its political center. Zumbi was wounded during the fighting yet escaped. The Confederation fragmented into smaller, more mobile units. Palmares entered its final phase. Even after the destruction of Makako, resistance continued. Zumbi did not surrender. For nearly 2 years, he remained at large, leading remnants of Palmares through forests that had sheltered generations before him. This period is the most difficult to reconstruct. Portuguese sources are vague and often contradictory. What is clear is that Zumbi's survival itself became an embarrassment to colonial authority. A man without a capital, without an army in the conventional sense, continued to resist an empire. That fact alone mattered. After the fall of Makako in 1694, Palmares no longer existed as a centralized political entity. The confederation that had endured for nearly a century was fractured into small, mobile groups scattered across the forested interior. Yet resistance did not end. Zumbi survived the assault wounded but alive. Portuguese commanders expected that the destruction of Palmares' political center would bring immediate surrender. Instead, they encountered something they had failed to anticipate. Resistance that no longer depended on a capital, a council, or a fixed population. Zumbi continued to lead a guerrilla resistance from concealment. His followers were fewer now, resources scarcer, but his refusal to submit remained unchanged. For colonial authorities, this persistence transformed Zumbi from a military problem into a symbolic one. As long as he lived, Palmares lived. By 1695, Portuguese authorities intensified efforts to capture Zumbi specifically. The campaign shifted from open warfare to pursuit, surveillance, and betrayal. Rewards were offered. Informants were cultivated. Former allies, coerced captives, and even former palmaristas were interrogated or pressured. Colonial sources indicate that Zumbi's location was ultimately revealed by Antonio Soares, a former companion who had been captured and promised freedom in exchange for cooperation. The details of this betrayal remain limited in the archive, but the pattern is familiar across colonial histories. Resistance is often undone not by force alone, but by exhaustion and coercion. On November 20, 1695, Zumbi was ambushed and killed. He was approximately 40 years old. Zumbi's death was not treated as an endpoint. It was treated as an opportunity. Portuguese authorities decapitated his body and transported his head to Recife, where it was publicly displayed. This act followed a long-standing colonial practice, the use of mutilated bodies to demonstrate dominance and discourage rebellion. The message was explicit. Colonial officials sought to prove that Zumbi was not immortal, not supernatural, not protected by ancestral forces. He was, they insisted, merely a man, and men could be destroyed. The display of his head was meant to silence stories, crush hope, and erase the possibility that Palmares might rise again. Failed. For what the archive cannot contain. Portuguese records mark Zumbi's death as a victory. Official correspondence speaks of restored order, reasserted authority, and the final elimination of a long-standing threat. But these documents reveal more through omission than declaration. They do not record celebration among the enslaved population. They do not record relief. They do not record peace. What followed instead was continued unrest, further escapes, and the persistence of quilombos throughout Brazil well into the 19th century. Palmares was destroyed, but the conditions that produced it were not. V. Memory beyond erasure. For centuries, Zumbi's story survived not primarily in official histories, but in oral tradition, Afro-Brazilian cultural memory, and the symbolic language of resistance. His name circulated quietly, then openly, then defiantly. In the 20th century, as Brazil confronted the legacies of slavery and racial inequality, Zumbi re-emerged as a central figure in national memory. He was reclaimed not as a myth, but as a historical actor whose life exposed the contradictions of colonial narratives. Today, November 20th, the date of his death, is commemorated in Brazil as Black Consciousness Day, a recognition not only of Zumbi himself, but of the collective struggle he represented. This commemoration is not universal, uncontested, or complete. Memory remains a battleground, but the fact of recognition marks a reversal of colonial intention. The spectacle meant to erase him preserved him instead. Zumbi was not a flawless hero. He ruled in wartime. He made decisions under extreme pressure. The historical record does not support romantic idealization, but neither does it support colonial caricature. Zumbi was a political leader shaped by enslavement, resistance, and survival. He defended a society that rejected slavery categorically, not selectively. He refused freedom that required the continued bondage of others. That refusal defines his legacy more than any battlefield victory. Palmares did not end with Zumbi's death as an idea, even if it ended as a political entity. Its example reshaped the imagination of freedom in the Americas. It demonstrated that enslaved Africans and their descendants were not merely resisting oppression, they were building alternatives. Societies with agriculture, governance, diplomacy, and defense existed beyond colonial control. This truth unsettled empires then, continues to unsettle narratives now.